Long ago, before roads crossed the mountains, and before villages were filled with houses and lights, there stood a beautiful mountain in the heart of Luzon. Its slopes were covered with enormous trees. Crystal clear streams flowed between mossy rocks. Wildflowers painted the forest floor with brilliant colors. And in the early morning, when golden sunlight touched the mountain peaks, the entire forest seemed to wake up. But there was something about the mountain that made the villagers speak in whispers. One morning, a young farmer named Juan wandered deep into the forest. He was searching for firewood for his family when he heard the gentle sound of water. Juan followed the stream, and there, beside the water, stood a young woman. She was gathering wildflowers, as if she had been waiting there all morning. Maria greeted him with a gentle smile. Then she noticed his empty basket. "Are you searching for something?" she asked. "Only firewood," Juan answered. "My family needs it." Maria smiled and pointed toward an old tree. Beneath the old tree, Juan found more firewood than he could carry. He looked back at the young woman, but she was nowhere to be seen. That evening, Juan told his mother about the kind stranger in the forest. His mother listened quietly, then whispered, "Maria Makiling." His mother smiled and looked toward the mountain. "They say Maria Makiling watches over these forests and helps those who truly need her." And soon, the villagers began noticing something wonderful. When someone had little to eat, the forest seemed to provide. But Maria never asked for anything in return. For many years, the village lived peacefully beneath the mountain. But as more people arrived, the village began to grow. And slowly, their needs became wants. Soon, some villagers began taking more from the mountain. More wood, more fruit, more animals. And little by little, the forest began to change. Juan tried to warn them. "Take only what you need," he said. But some villagers only laughed. But one man wanted more than the others. His name was Don Pedro. He dreamed of owning everything the mountain could give. Don Pedro sent men deeper into the forest. Trees were cut, animals were hunted, and the mountain was stripped of its gifts. Still, they wanted more. But something was changing. The forest grew strangely quiet, and the animals began to disappear. Deep within the mountain, Maria Makiling watched, and she knew. That night, Maria appeared before Juan once more. "Tell them to stop," she whispered. "The mountain gives freely, but it must also be protected." The next morning, Juan warned the villagers, but Don Pedro refused to listen. "The mountain has always given us more," he said. The villagers returned to the forest, but this time, the mountain answered. A sudden wind swept through the trees, and everything fell silent. When the silence ended, the villagers found something strange. The trees no longer gave as they once had. But Don Pedro refused to stop. So they went deeper than ever before. The trees grew older, the path grew darker, and then they heard something moving in the forest. The villagers froze. Then, from among the trees, a woman appeared. It was Maria Makiling, and she had come to warn them. Maria warned Don Pedro to leave the forest alone, but he refused. He believed the mountain belonged to those who could claim it. Don Pedro turned away from Maria. Then the earth began to tremble. The trees shook, and the mountain gave its warning. The villagers were frightened, but Don Pedro called the tremor nothing more than a warning from nature, and he ordered them to keep going. But the deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The path they knew was gone, and suddenly they could no longer find their way home. They walked for hours, but every path led them back. Fear spread among the men. Then Juan remembered Maria's warning. Juan finally understood. The mountain was protecting itself. He begged them to leave, but Don Pedro had one last idea. Deep inside the mountain, Don Pedro found something precious. His fear disappeared. Once again, he wanted more. Don Pedro ordered his men to take everything they could. But before they could begin, Maria appeared. This time, her voice was firm. Maria gave Don Pedro one final chance, but greed had already taken hold of his heart. He ordered his men to continue. The mountain began to awaken. The trees roared in the wind, and the ground shook beneath them. For the first time, Don Pedro was afraid. The villagers ran for their lives. In the chaos, Don Pedro was separated from the others, and suddenly, he was alone. Alone in the silent forest, Don Pedro finally saw Maria. She had not come to punish him. She had come to give him one last chance. For a moment, Don Pedro wanted to turn back, but then he remembered the riches he had seen, and greed won once again. Don Pedro returned to the hidden clearing. He reached for its treasures once more. But this time, the mountain refused to give. But Don Pedro would not accept defeat. His fear turned into anger. If the mountain would not give, he would take it. Don Pedro raised his hand against the ancient tree. But before he could strike again, the forest answered. The mountain would not surrender. Maria had seen everything. She stepped from the mist and faced Don Pedro. This time, there was no warning left to give. Then the mountain answered. The earth trembled beneath Don Pedro's feet, and suddenly, he knew he had gone too far. Terrified, Don Pedro tried to escape, but every path led him deeper into the forest. The mountain would not let him go. At last, Don Pedro understood his mistake. He had taken too much from the mountain, and now he begged Maria for forgiveness. Maria forgave him, but she gave him one final lesson. The mountain was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be protected. Don Pedro left the mountain a changed man, but Maria knew the people had forgotten its true value. Slowly, she began to disappear. Years passed, and Maria was never seen again. But the people remembered the mysterious guardian, and her story became a legend. And though Maria was no longer seen, some say she never truly left. For whenever the mountain is threatened, its guardian is still watching. Do you believe Maria Makiling is still watching over the mountain? Tell me in the comments.